My sister was a dancer, so like many young men in ballet, sisters led the way. So I was simply, I tagged along. I had to wait for her in a car, and as a 6-year-old boy, I didn't like doing that. So eventually, I sort of migrated up to the studios, and before long, I was watching and I was like, oh, that looks easy. And the teacher overheard me. She says, oh, well, why don't you come on back next week? And I was like, I will. And so I told my mom all week, so I'm going to ballet next week. She was like, what an odd kid, right? And like, tomorrow I'm going to ballet. She was like, what are you talking about exactly? I said, well, I'm going to do ballet. And the teacher invited me. And so my mom brought me, and she said to the teacher, like, okay, so Michael's convinced that you've invited him to, she's like, oh yeah, that little boy, yeah, I could bring him in. She couldn't remember it all. But I started, and of course I was the center of attention. I was the only boy. And who doesn't love that? So I stayed with it. Both my parents were in Indian residential school. So the thought of sending off their youngest, because I was the first generation in my family, my sister and I were the first generations that weren't taken, right, by the government. So it's not like ancient history. This is quite recent. So my parents weren't about to voluntarily send me to a residence. Like, what kind of, that's insane. So they said, well, we'll try it for a year. We'll see if Michael likes it, see if, because the school was always very clear. We'll take him for a year, and we'll see, what happens to his body, what happens to his bones, and maybe he'll come back next year. So it was kind of like a year-to-year thing. So they took a year's leave of absence, going, oh, this is an experiment, and well, I kept going. So they ended up staying here, and both my parents actually spent the rest of their lives in the area. It was like a lot of kids that come here. It's like this wild art form, and we're all sort of like deep in it. And then we come out the other side, and that's really actually when I kind of realized I was a storyteller. What stayed connected for me was the idea that movement without words is actually quite sophisticated. That silence and stillness tell stories, as well as pattern, gesture. So that's what I take away from the classical idiom is the power of movement in storytelling. I loved it. It was just like some, of course it's a culmination. Like when you come out of the ballet school, there's a really pretty clear success story when you join this company. And so I was able to experience that, and I had some good roles, but I didn't connect with the artistic director, that I was working for, and I also at the time I was becoming more and more conscious of my own cultural background and history, and standing, in a powdered wig with buckles on my shoes, with lace hanging from my. I was like, what am I doing? What am I doing? And so I was like, okay, I'm out of here. And so I actually moved to New York City, and I danced with the American choreographer Elliot Feld, and that to me was like a true high point in my dance career, because I danced some incredible masterworks and was part of his creation process. He's a very active choreographer. So for 3 years, I was like deep in a creation-based dance company. Elliot's rigor as a choreographer, just his insistence on not repeating himself, his musicality, his inventiveness, that really inspired me. I think our methodologies are different, although I do choreograph chronologically as he does, like what's first, what's next. I know a lot of people don't operate that way, and I've done some theater creation that doesn't work that way, but very often I'm quite linear, so I think I share that with him. I actually became interested and began to research my own cultural dance expression once I began choreographing. So I had to sort of return to it and then incorporate those ideas into the kind of choreography I began to pursue earlier in my career. The paintbrushes I was working with were European paintbrushes. So I said, well, I'm sort of working with two sort of perhaps contradictory ideas. And if you look at my earliest sort of choreographic works, they're very balletic. And it's only sort of later, after I researched my own culture's dances, that different kinds of movement ideas started to be more present in the outward expression. And then as I began to make more and more theater works and dance theater, of course I started to leave classical ballet and that idiom sort of much further behind. But I think it relates actually more to Eliot and Eliot felt is that each piece needs a form in order to tell that story. So I was not trying to seek an indigenous storytelling mechanism. I'm going to tell indigenous stories. That's because I am, right? And what became more important to me was, well, what particular story am I telling, and how would it be more effective for the audience to receive this information if we're doing this kind of movement or that kind of movement, or does the design speak to us? So in a way that was influenced much more by Eliot Feld, because he said, I think there has to be, every piece has to have its own language. And that's where I sort of became inspired to tell different kinds of stories. I always felt that as a sort of hired gun, like I'm coming in to, create movement for this piece or coach an actor on this thing, that I felt I needed a larger canvas for the ideas that I was starting to have about work. So it was after working with Native Earth, and I directed Almighty Voice and His Wife, which is a seminal play by Daniel David Moses, that I said, I have this idea for a dance theater work that I'd like to create. And I said, I think I need a company in order to access funding, access venues, etc. So I founded Signal Theater. And Signal Theater's mandate is to create intercultural performance work that explores essentially indigenous stories and that first work was From Thine Eyes, which we presented through DanceWorks, maybe Beck's company. And it was at Harbourfront, and it was, a beautiful work, really quite successful. It incorporated text, incorporated dance, incorporated really complex design elements, and it established the intercultural sort of working process. I believe actually that when we hire non-Indigenous performers, they come into intersection with our ways of knowing and working. And in a way, we indigenize those artists to our protocols, our stories, and we create allies. We all come from two strains of thought, twinned strands of experience. After I sort of transitioned from being a dance performer, dance artist, I became quite interested in acting. And so I actually started doing more and more theater work, plays, in order to retrain myself, because we didn't have language, like spoken text as part of our sort of training background. And so I began literally learning on the job, like in plays, and like, oh, this is a table read. I don't know what a table read is. It's like, okay, so we're just sitting around, studying the text and saying it out loud, and now we're putting it on its feet. Now we're blocking. So it was text based, like the exploration, and of course that was new to me. But it's theater and that kind of theater work that I became quite focused upon, and that allowed me to then make a transition into film and television, which weirdly is more like dance than it is like plays, because language is privileged in plays, whereas image is privileged in cinema. Every day on the set, I rely on my dance background for success. To be quite honest, the rigor of it. No film project has ever been as hard as Glenn Gilmore's classes, right? Some things are difficult, like long hours, lots of waiting, but just the grueling nature of classical training. I always feel like any work I do afterwards is always much easier. The roles that I'm accessing right now are very multidimensional. The artists that I'm working with are, behind the camera, in front of the camera, are artists that I esteem, that I watch, award-winning actors, award-winning directors. So the scripts are getting better, the productions are getting richer. So now I'm finding that my acting work is now even outstripping my earlier sort of rigorous and at that point career-defining work. So yeah, I love what I do right now. I think it's only been probably within the last 4 years or 5 years that I don't think of myself as a dancer first. I think of myself really as an actor and director now. But until I was like 47, I was like, what do you do? I'm a teacher, but in the back of my head I was like, I'm a dancer who teaches, right? So it's a dominant part of my personality. I think like a dancer. I tell anyone who asks, I owe my success to it.